Robert Chen stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, watching the city lights flicker below like a million tiny stars. It was his 68th birthday, and he was completely alone. No party, no cake, no singing. Just him, his expensive whiskey, and a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush him. The apartment was something out of a magazine. Marble floors, designer furniture, artwork that cost more than most people made in a year. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly empty. Robert had spent 40 years building his tech company from nothing, turning a simple idea into a fortune worth over $200 million. He'd achieved what most people only dream about. But standing there that night, looking at his reflection in the dark window, he felt like the poorest man alive. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Helen Rodriguez, confirming their meeting for the next morning. Estate planning, she'd called it. A fancy way of saying, what happens to all your money when you die? Robert poured himself another drink and sat down on his leather couch that probably cost more than a car. He thought about that meeting, about what he was supposed to decide. The truth was simple and painful. Robert had no one. His parents had passed away years ago. He'd never married, too focused on building his empire. No children, no siblings, no cousins he actually knew. His friends, if he could call them that, were mostly business associates who smiled at him because of his bank account. When was the last time someone had called him just to see how he was doing? He couldn't remember. Robert had always told himself it didn't matter. Success was enough. Money was enough. But lately, especially at night when the office closed and the meetings ended, he felt a gnawing emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. What was the point of it all? He'd built this massive fortune, and for what? To leave it to some charity that would put his name on a building? That felt hollow, meaningless. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he lay in his king-sized bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about his life. The decisions he'd made, the things he'd sacrificed. By the time the sun started to peek through his curtains, Robert had made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, Helen arrived at his office right on time. She was in her 50s, professional, efficient, and one of the few people who actually seemed to care about him, beyond his money. She'd been his lawyer for 15 years, and somewhere along the way they'd become friends. Real friends. Happy belated birthday, she said, setting her briefcase down. Did you do anything special? Same as always, Robert replied with a slight smile. Me, myself, and I had a quiet evening. Helen's expression softened with concern, but she didn't push it. Instead, she pulled out a stack of documents. I've prepared several options for your estate. We have charitable trusts, foundations, university endowments. I've highlighted the tax benefits of each approach. Robert didn't even look at the papers. Helen, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm a good person? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She set down her pen and looked at him carefully. You're asking me this why? Just answer honestly. Helen took a breath. You're brilliant, Robert. You've always been fair in business. You pay your employees well. You've never cheated anyone, but... She paused. But what? But you're disconnected. You live up in this tower, surrounded by luxury, and I'm not sure you really see people anymore. Not really. When was the last time you had a conversation with someone who didn't work for you or want something from you? Her words stung because they were true. Robert nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He told her about his idea then. It sounded crazy even as the words left his mouth, but once he started, he couldn't stop. He wanted to leave his fortune to someone who deserved it, but not someone from his world. Not another wealthy person or a business connection. He wanted to find someone real, someone with character, someone who understood what it meant to struggle and still chose kindness. And how exactly do you plan to find this person? Helen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be conventional. I'm going to become homeless. Helen's eyes widened. Excuse me? Not really homeless, Robert clarified. I'm going to pretend. Dress like a beggar. Live on the streets for a month. I want to see how people treat someone who has nothing. Because that's when you really know someone's character, isn't it? When you can't offer them anything in return. Robert, that's insane. It's dangerous. You could get hurt or sick or I could find what I'm looking for. Robert's voice was firm.
Helen, I've spent my whole life in boardrooms and penthouses.
I've made deals with millionaires and negotiated with executives, but I don't know anything about real people anymore. I don't know what kindness looks like when it doesn't benefit someone. I need to see it for myself. Helen argued with him for over an hour. She listed every possible danger, every reason why this was a terrible idea. But Robert had made up his mind. Finally exhausted, she leaned back in her chair. If I can't talk you out of this, at least let me set up some safety measures. A tracking device, someone watching from a distance, a way to contact me if things go wrong. Robert agreed to some precautions, though he insisted they be minimal. The whole point was to experience what homeless people actually experienced. Too much protection would defeat the purpose. Over the next week, Robert prepared for his transformation. He went to thrift stores in neighborhoods far from anywhere he might be recognized, buying worn jeans, faded t-shirts, a jacket with a broken zipper. He bought an old sleeping bag from a garage sale. He stopped shaving, stopped getting his hair cut. Every morning he looked in the mirror and watched himself become unrecognizable. His employees at the company were told he was taking a month-long vacation abroad.
Only Helen knew the truth.
She'd arranged for a small safety net, a GPS tracker sewn into his jacket, a prepaid phone hidden in his sock, and one of her most trusted investigators who would check on him from a distance once a day. This is still crazy, Helen said the night before he was set to begin. They were in his apartment and she was seeing him in his costume for the first time. She barely recognized him. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by shaggy, unwashed hair. The designer stubble he usually maintained had become an unkempt beard. In his thrift store clothes, he looked like a completely different person. If anyone sees you, no one will, Robert interrupted. That's the point. People don't really look at homeless people. I've walked past them 1,000 times myself and never really saw them. Now I'll understand why. Helen handed him a bag with some basic supplies, a bottle of water, a couple of granola bars, a small first aid kit. At least take these. And Robert, please be careful. That night, Robert slept on his comfortable bed for the last time in a month, or tried to sleep anyway. His mind raced with anticipation and, if he was honest, fear. What was he really going to find out there? About others and maybe more importantly about himself? The next morning arrived with gray skies and a cold wind. Perfect weather for a beggar, Robert thought grimly. He dressed in his worn clothes, grabbed his sleeping bag and took one last look at his apartment. All that luxury, all that comfort. In a few hours he'd be sitting on a sidewalk somewhere, completely invisible to the world that had once revered him. Helen met him downstairs with her car. She'd insisted on dropping him off at his chosen location, a busy corner in the financial district, ironically close to where his office had been when he first started his company. Robert remembered walking these streets as a young man, hungry and determined, sleeping on a friend's couch and eating ramen for dinner. That was 40 years ago. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have nothing. Last chance to change your mind, Helen said as she pulled up to the corner. Robert looked out at the stream of people rushing past, all dressed for success, all focused on their own lives and problems. I'll see you in a month, he said. He got out of the car, sleeping bag under his arm, and watched Helen drive away. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Then he found a spot against a building wall, sat down on the cold concrete, and waited to see what would happen. The first hour was strange. People flowed past him like water around a rock. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and not one looked at him. Not really. Some glanced, then quickly looked away. Others seemed to actively avoid even acknowledging his existence. Robert had attended meetings where million-dollar deals were made, where powerful people hung on his every word. Now sitting on this sidewalk, he was completely invisible. A woman in a business suit walked past, talking loudly on her phone about a client meeting. Her heel caught on the edge of his sleeping bag and she stumbled slightly. For a second, Robert thought she might fall, but she caught herself, shot him an angry look as if he'd deliberately tried to trip her, and hurried away without a word. No, excuse me. No acknowledgement that he was even human. Around noon, the lunch rush began. The smell of food from nearby restaurants was torture. Robert had a little money in his pocket, but he'd decided to make this as authentic as possible. He'd placed a small cup in front of him, like he'd seen other homeless people do. In 3 hours, no one had put anything in it. His back ached from sitting on the concrete. His legs were stiff. The cold was seeping through his clothes, and he realized his expensive jacket from the thrift store wasn't nearly warm enough. This was just day one, and he was already uncomfortable. How did people live like this for months, years, or their whole lives? As the afternoon wore on, Robert began to understand something profound. Being homeless wasn't just about not having a home. It was about being erased. People looked through him like he was made of glass. Mothers pulled their children closer when they walked past. Businessmen stepped around him with expressions of disgust. He was right there, visible, human, and yet completely unseen. By the time evening arrived and the foot traffic thinned, Robert had $7.35 in his cup. Not one person had stopped to talk to him. Not one had asked if he was okay or if he needed help. He'd gone from being one of the most respected businessmen in the city to being trash on the sidewalk, and the transformation had taken exactly 0 seconds. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Robert pulled his sleeping bag around him and tried to get comfortable against the cold wall. His first night on the streets was beginning, and he had 29 more ahead of him. He thought about his warm bed, his heated apartment, his stocked refrigerator. All of it felt like a dream now, like another lifetime. But he'd made his decision. He was going to see this through. Somewhere out there in this city were people with real character, real kindness, real hearts. People who would help someone even when they had nothing to gain from it. Robert was determined to find them. His entire fortune was waiting for whoever proved they deserved it. As he closed his eyes that first night, listening to the city sounds around him and feeling the cold seep into his bones, Robert Chen wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, or the most important decision. Only time would tell. Robert woke up on his third morning on the streets feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. Every muscle in his body ached. The concrete had been unforgiving, and despite his sleeping bag, the cold had seeped into his bones during the night. He sat up slowly, his back protesting with every movement, and watched the city come to life around him. The sunrise was actually beautiful from down here, he noticed. Something he'd never paid attention to from his penthouse. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, painting the buildings in warm colors. But the beauty was quickly overshadowed by the harsh reality of his situation. His stomach growled painfully. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, trying to survive on the few dollars he'd collected in his cup. The morning rush began like clockwork. Thousands of people poured onto the sidewalks, heading to their offices, their meetings, their important appointments. Robert watched them all. These people who lived in the same city as him but might as well have been on a different planet. A man in a suit that probably cost $3,000 stepped over Robert's outstretched legs without even looking down. A woman with a designer handbag wrinkled her nose as she passed, as if Robert smelled bad. Maybe he did. He hadn't showered in 3 days. Around 8:30, something different happened. A young woman stopped in front of him. She was wearing scrubs, the kind nurses wear, and she had a coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. She looked tired, like she'd been up all night, but her eyes were kind. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you hungry?" Robert looked up at her, surprised that someone was actually talking to him. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She handed him the paper bag. Inside was a breakfast sandwich, still warm. "I always buy 2 on my way home from my shift," she explained. "One for me, one for whoever needs it. There's also an orange in there." "Thank you," Robert managed to say. His voice came out rough, scratchy from not being used much. "What's your name?" she asked, crouching down to his level. "Robert." "I'm Lily. Nice to meet you, Robert." She said it like she meant it, like she was meeting a colleague at work instead of a homeless man on the street. "I pass by here every morning around this time. I work the night shift at County Hospital. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd. Robert opened the bag and bit into the sandwich. He'd eaten at 5-star restaurants, had meals prepared by celebrity chefs, but nothing had ever tasted as good as that simple breakfast sandwich. As he ate, he felt something he hadn't felt in the past 3 days. Hope. Lily came back the next morning. And the morning after that? Each time she brought him coffee and food. Sometimes she'd sit with him for a few minutes, asking how he was doing, telling him about her shift. She talked about her patients, about the challenges of being a nurse, about her 7-year-old daughter Katie, who was being raised by Lily's mother, while Lily worked nights to make ends meet. "Why do you do this?" Robert asked her on the 5th morning. "Buy food for me, I mean." "You don't know me?" Lily smiled a little sadly. "My dad was homeless for 2 years after he lost his job and got sick. People would walk past him every day like he was invisible. But there was this one woman, Mrs. Chen, who brought him soup every Tuesday. She wasn't rich or anything. She just cared." My dad said she saved his life, not just with the food, but by reminding him he was still human, still worth something. She passed away before I could thank her. So now I do what she did. I figure it's the least I can do. Robert felt his throat tighten. Here was this young woman, working herself to exhaustion, raising a daughter, probably struggling to pay bills, and she was spending her money to feed a stranger, because someone had once shown her father the same kindness. But Lily wasn't the only one. On his 6th day, a construction worker named Tony started showing up during lunch hour. He was a big guy with calloused hands and a thick accent, probably in his late 40s. He'd sit down next to Robert, open his lunchbox, and share whatever his wife had packed for him. She always makes too much anyway, Tony would say with a grin, handing Robert a sandwich or some pasta. Says I need to eat more, but look at me. Do I look like I'm starving? Tony would talk while they ate, telling stories about his work, about the buildings he was helping construct, about his 3 kids and how proud he was that his oldest daughter had gotten into college. First one in our family, he'd say, his eyes shining. She's going to be a doctor. Can you believe that? My little girl, a doctor. One day Robert asked Tony the same question he'd asked Lily. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't have to share your lunch. Tony looked at him seriously. My brother, he fell on hard times a few years back. Lost his job, lost his apartment, ended up on the streets. I tried to help him, but he was proud, you know. Didn't want charity from family. Eventually, he got back on his feet, but those months were hell for all of us. I kept thinking about him out there hungry, alone. So now when I see someone in your situation, I think maybe someone somewhere is being kind to someone else's brother. Maybe that's how it works. We all look out for each other. Robert learned something important during those first 2 weeks. The people who had the least were often the most willing to share. The wealthy business people who passed him barely saw him as human. But the nurses, the construction workers, the people who understood struggle, they were the ones who stopped. They were the ones who cared. On his 10th day, Robert met Mrs. Gladys Patterson. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with white hair and hands that shook slightly from age. She walked slowly past his corner every Thursday morning, always at the same time carrying 2 shopping bags. The first Thursday she passed, she stopped and dug through her purse, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill. Here you go, dear, she said, pressing it into his hand. It's not much, but it's something. Thank you, Robert said. But are you sure? You don't have to. Nonsense. We have to look after each other. That's what community means. The next Thursday she came by again with another $1. This time Robert tried to refuse it. Ma'am, please. I can tell you need this more than I do. Mrs. Patterson gave him a sharp look. Young man, don't you dare tell me what I need. I'm on a fixed income, that's true. But I've got a roof over my head and food in my belly. Some folks don't even have that. Now you take this $1 and buy yourself something to eat. Over the following weeks, Robert learned Mrs. Patterson's story through their brief conversations. She'd been a teacher for 40 years before retiring. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her with just Social Security to live on. Her apartment was small, her budget tight, but every Thursday, without fail, she'd bring him that $1. But it was more than just the $1. Robert began to notice something else about Mrs. Patterson. She knew all the homeless people in the area by name. She'd stop and talk to each one, asking how they were doing, if they needed anything. She organized a small group that met at a church on Sunday afternoons, where she'd share information about shelters, food banks, free clinics. She'd write down addresses and phone numbers on index cards and hand them out. Knowledge is power, she'd tell people. You need to know what resources are available. One Sunday, Robert followed her to the church gathering. About 15 homeless people were there, sitting in folding chairs in the basement. Mrs. Patterson had brought a box of donuts, paid for with her limited money, and she went around making sure everyone got one, plus coffee. Now, she said, standing at the front of the room, I found out about a new shelter opening next month on 5th Street. They're going to have 50 beds and they don't require you to attend religious services to stay there. I've got applications here for anyone interested. She talked about a free dental clinic, about a program that helped people get ID cards, about a church that was hiring for some cleaning work. She had all this information organized, written down, ready to share. This woman with almost no money herself was running her own support network for people in need. After the meeting, Robert approached her. Mrs. Patterson, you're amazing. How long have you been doing this? She smiled. About 3 years now. After my Henry died, I was so lonely. Felt like I had no purpose anymore. Then one day I started talking to a homeless woman near my building, and I realized she had no idea where to get help. So I started researching, making lists, trying to connect people with resources. It gives me something to do and it helps folks. Win-win. But Robert's experience wasn't all positive. He also saw the other side of humanity, the part that made his heart heavy. There was the businessman who kicked his cup over one morning, scattering his few coins across the sidewalk. "Get a job, you lazy bum," the man had snarled before walking away. Robert had recognized him. They'd been in meetings together years ago. The man had shaken Robert's hand, laughed at his jokes, called him brilliant. Now with Robert sitting on the street, that same man didn't recognize him and treated him like garbage. There was the woman in designer clothes who called the police on him one afternoon, claiming he was harassing people. He hadn't said a word to anyone, just sat quietly with his cup. But she insisted he was ruining the neighborhood and demanded he be removed. The police officers were kind enough, just asked him to move along, but the experience stung. Teenagers would sometimes walk by late at night, laughing and jeering. A couple of them threw food at him once, thinking it was funny. A half-eaten burger hit him in the chest and they ran away howling with laughter. Every day brought a mix of kindness and cruelty, and Robert absorbed it all. He started keeping a mental notebook of observations. The people who helped weren't random. They were usually people who'd struggled themselves. People who understood what it meant to be hungry, to be cold, to be invisible. By the end of the second week, Robert had a routine. Lily brought him breakfast. Tony shared his lunch. Mrs. Patterson stopped by on Thursdays. Other homeless people in the area started acknowledging him, nodding or saying hello. He was becoming part of a community he never knew existed. One night it started raining. Not a light drizzle, but a heavy downpour. Robert huddled under a store awning trying to stay dry, but the wind blew the rain sideways and he was soaked within minutes. His sleeping bag was drenched, his clothes stuck to his skin. He was shivering so hard his teeth chattered. Tony found him there around 10 at night, still shivering. "Come on," Tony said firmly. "You can't stay out here tonight. You'll get sick." "Where?" Robert started to ask. "My truck. It's not warm, but it's dry. I got some blankets in there." Tony led him to his pickup truck parked a few blocks away and opened the back. There were moving blankets inside, the kind used for protecting furniture. They smelled like sawdust and were rough, but they were dry. Tony helped Robert climb into the truck bed and covered him with the blankets. "I'll come check on you in the morning," Tony said. "Try to get some sleep." Robert lay there in the back of that truck wrapped in moving blankets and he cried. Not from the cold or discomfort, but from the overwhelming kindness of it all. Tony had a family at home, probably a warm bed waiting for him, but he'd taken time to make sure a homeless stranger had shelter from the rain. As his third week began, Robert realized something profound. He'd spent his whole life around wealthy, successful people. People with power and influence. But he'd never met anyone as truly rich as Lily, Tony, and Mrs. Patterson. They had so little in terms of money, but they had something far more valuable. They had compassion. They had humanity. They had the kind of character that couldn't be bought or taught in business school. These were the people Robert had been looking for. These were the ones who deserved his fortune, not because they needed it, though they clearly did, but because they understood what wealth should really be used for, to help others, to build community, to remind people they matter. Robert still had another week left in his experiment, but he already knew what he was going to do. The only question now was how to do it right. How to reveal the truth without making them feel used or tricked, because these three people had given him something priceless. They'd restored his faith in humanity. They'd shown him what it meant to be truly rich. As he settled in for another night on the cold pavement, Robert smiled for the first time in weeks. His body ached, his stomach was never full, and he missed his comfortable bed desperately. But he'd found what he was looking for. He'd found the people who would help him create a legacy that actually mattered. Robert had been on the streets for 3 weeks now, and he'd learned more about human nature than he had in his entire life. But there was something nagging at him. Lily, Tony, and Mrs. Patterson were kind to him, yes. But how deep did that kindness go? Would they still be good people when faced with real temptation? When helping him might cost them something significant? He'd spent 40 years in business learning that people were complicated. Someone could seem honest until money was involved. They could appear generous until it required real sacrifice. Robert needed to know if these three were truly as good as they seemed, or if their kindness had limits. So he came up with a plan. It felt manipulative and that bothered him. But he had to know. His entire fortune was at stake and, more importantly, his legacy. He couldn't give everything to someone only to discover they weren't who he thought they were. The first test would be for Lily. Robert had noticed she always walked the same route to and from the hospital, cutting through a small park about 2 blocks from where he usually sat. Early one morning, before she made her usual stop, Robert positioned himself on a bench along her walking path. Next to him, he carefully placed a wallet. Not just any wallet, but one he'd prepared specially. Inside were 5 $100 bills, several credit cards with a fake name, a driver's license, and family photos he'd printed from stock images online. He'd even worn it in his pocket for a few days so it looked used, loved, real. Then he'd dropped it on the ground near the bench, making it look like someone had lost it. Robert sat there pretending to sleep, his baseball cap pulled low over his face, watching through barely opened eyes. His heart was pounding. Part of him hoped Lily wouldn't even notice the wallet. Part of him was terrified of what she might do if she did. At 8:15, right on schedule, Lily came walking through the park. She looked exhausted as always, her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift. She was looking at her phone, probably texting her mother about picking up her daughter. She almost walked right past the bench, but then she saw it. The wallet lying there on the ground. She stopped, looked around, then picked it up. Robert's chest tightened. This was it, $500 in cash. For someone like Lily, who worked double shifts and could barely make ends meet, that money could change everything. It could pay bills, buy her daughter new shoes, maybe even give her a night off from worrying. Lily opened the wallet and Robert saw her eyes widen when she spotted the cash. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, she stood completely still. Robert could almost see the wheels turning in her head. The temptation, the justification. Nobody would know. I need this more than whoever lost it probably does. But then she closed the wallet and turned toward Robert. Hey, she said softly, touching his shoulder. Excuse me. Are you awake? Robert pretended to stir like he'd been sleeping. Huh? What? Is this yours? She held up the wallet. I found it right here by the bench. Robert looked at it and shook his head. No, that's not mine. I don't have anything like that. The hope that had flickered in Lily's face when she thought maybe, just maybe, this man had caught a lucky break, faded. Okay, she said. Well, someone lost this and they're probably panicking. There's a lot of money in here and credit cards, everything. I need to get this to the police station. The police station is like 10 blocks from here, Robert said. Aren't you tired? You just worked all night. I know, but... Lily looked at the wallet, then at her watch. This is important. Someone needs this back. Look, there are pictures of kids in here. This person probably has a family. Robert saw her exhaustion, saw how much effort it would take for her to go out of her way. You could just leave it here, he suggested. Someone else will find it. Lily shook her head firmly. No, what if the wrong person finds it? They might just take the cash and throw the rest away. At least if I take it to the police, the owner has a chance of getting it back. She paused, then looked at Robert with concern. Actually, would you come with me? To the police station? Me, why? Because you were here when I found it. You're a witness. And honestly, she lowered her voice, sometimes when someone like me walks into a police station, they don't always believe us. But if there are 2 of us saying the same thing, they'll have to listen. Robert was stunned. Not only was she turning in the wallet, but she wanted him, a homeless man, to come with her because she thought his presence would help. She was including him, treating him like he mattered. They walked together to the police station, Lily moving slowly to match his pace. She was so tired she was almost stumbling, but she kept going. At the station, she handed over the wallet to the officer at the desk and carefully explained where and when she'd found it. The officer took her information and thanked her. As they left the station, Lily let out a long sigh. I really hope they find the owner, she said. That money could have probably helped them a lot. It could have helped you too, Robert said quietly. Lily looked at him with surprise. It wasn't mine to keep. That wouldn't be right. She checked her watch. Oh no, I'm going to be late picking up Katie. I've got to run. I'll see you tomorrow morning, okay? Same time, same place. and she hurried off toward the bus stop, leaving Robert standing there on the sidewalk. She'd passed the test. Not just passed it, but exceeded every expectation. $500 that could have changed her life, and she hadn't hesitated to do the right thing. 2 days later, it was Tony's turn. This test was different because Tony was different. He was physically strong, capable, and proud. Robert needed to see how he'd react in a crisis when helping someone might put Tony himself at risk. Robert waited until lunchtime, when Tony usually showed up. But before Tony arrived, Robert took some of the medication Helen had given him for emergencies. It was something that would make him appear sick without actually being in danger, lowering his heart rate and making him pale and sweaty. He'd argued with Helen for an hour before she'd reluctantly agreed to give it to him, making him promise to take only the smallest dose. When Tony walked up with his lunchbox, as cheerful as always, he found Robert slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Robert had practiced this, making sure he looked genuinely ill. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow. "Robert? Hey, Robert." Tony dropped his lunchbox and knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" "What's wrong?" Robert mumbled something incoherent, letting his head loll to the side. He kept his eyes barely open, watching Tony's reaction. Tony didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance at the corner of 5th and Main. I've got a man here." "He's unresponsive. Looks like he might be having a medical emergency." While waiting for the ambulance, Tony took off his own jacket and draped it over Robert. He held Robert's hand, talking to him steadily. "You're gonna be okay, buddy. Help is coming. Just hang in there." When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics immediately started checking Robert's vital signs. One of them looked at Tony. "Are you family?" "No, I'm his friend," Tony said. "Okay, well, we're going to take him to County Hospital. You can follow if you want, but you can't ride in the ambulance unless you're family." "Which hospital did you say?" "County?" "Yes, sir." The paramedics loaded Robert onto a stretcher. As they were putting him in the ambulance, Robert heard Tony on his phone. "Hey boss, it's Tony. Listen, I can't come back to the site this afternoon. I've got an emergency. Yeah, I know we're behind schedule, but this is important. I'll make up the hours tomorrow, I promise." Through his barely opened eyes, Robert watched Tony get into his old pickup truck and follow the ambulance. The man was giving up half a day's pay, probably making his boss angry, risking his job, because he thought Robert needed someone to be there for him. At the hospital, Robert kept up the act just long enough for the doctors to run basic tests. He'd told Helen to call ahead and arrange everything, so the medical staff knew what was really happening. They pretended to treat him, keeping him in the emergency room for about an hour. Tony sat in the waiting room the entire time. When Robert finally recovered and was released, Tony was there, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you're okay. They said you're dehydrated and malnourished, but you're gonna be fine." "You stayed?" Robert asked, genuinely moved even though he'd known Tony would. "Of course I stayed. You think I was gonna leave you here alone? Come on, let's get you something to eat." Tony took him to a diner and ordered him a full meal, soup, sandwich, coffee, even pie for dessert. He sat across from Robert, watching him eat, making sure he finished everything. "You gotta take better care of yourself, man. You scared me today." "I'm sorry," Robert said, and he meant it. "You didn't have to do all this. You probably lost wages because of me." Tony waved his hand dismissively. "Money comes and goes, but you only get one life, you know? What kind of person would I be if I just left you there on the sidewalk?" He paused, then added quietly, "My brother, when he was homeless, he got sick once, real sick, and people just walked by him for hours. By the time someone called for help, he almost died. I wasn't there for him then, but I can be here for you now." Robert had to look down at his plate so Tony wouldn't see the tears in his eyes. This man had sacrificed his workday, his pay, possibly even his job security for someone he barely knew. And he'd done it without thinking twice. The test for Mrs. Patterson came last, and it was the most subtle of all. Robert didn't need to test whether she'd steal money or abandon him in an emergency. He'd already seen her character in action dozens of times, but he wanted to understand her motivations on a deeper level. Was she helping people because she genuinely cared, or because it made her feel important? Was her kindness consistent or selective? So Robert started paying closer attention to her Sunday meetings at the church. He came early one week and helped set up chairs. He stayed late and watched how she interacted with people when she thought no one important was watching. What he saw amazed him. Mrs. Patterson treated everyone exactly the same, whether they were mentally ill, addicted, disabled, or just down on their luck. There was a man named Carl who came to the meetings who clearly had some kind of mental health issue. He'd sometimes shout random things or laugh at inappropriate times. Some of the other homeless people avoided him, uncomfortable with his unpredictable behavior. But Mrs. Patterson always made sure Carl got a donut, always sat next to him for a few minutes and asked about his week. She spoke to him with the same respect and kindness she showed everyone else. When Carl would start to get agitated, she'd gently redirect him, never with frustration or annoyance, always with patience. Robert also noticed that Mrs. Patterson never took credit for anything. When someone thanked her for the information she provided, she'd say, "Oh, I just happened to hear about it." When someone praised her for organizing the meetings, she'd say, "We're all in this together." One Sunday, Robert arrived at the church to find Mrs. Patterson sitting on the steps outside crying. He'd never seen her anything but cheerful and strong. He sat down beside her carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, are you all right?" She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be seen like this. "Oh, Robert, I'm fine, dear. Just having a moment. What's wrong?" She was quiet for a long time, then finally spoke. "I got a letter yesterday. My rent is going up. $50 more a month. I know that doesn't sound like much, but on my budget." She trailed off, then laughed bitterly. "Here I am trying to help everyone else, and I can't even help myself." "Maybe you should stop," Robert said gently. "Stop buying donuts for the meetings. Stop giving away that dollar every Thursday. Take care of yourself first." Mrs. Patterson looked at him with such fierce determination that he was taken aback. "Absolutely not. These people depend on this. It might not seem like much, a donut and some information, but for some folks this meeting is the only community they have. I'll figure something out. Maybe I'll eat a little less or keep the heat lower in my apartment, but I'm not going to stop helping people just because things are hard for me." "But why?" Robert asked. "Why is this so important to you?" That night, Robert called Helen from his secret phone. "I found them," he said. "I found the people I've been looking for." "Are you sure?" Helen asked. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Then it's time to end this. You've been out there almost a month. Come home, clean yourself up, and we'll arrange the meeting." But Robert wasn't quite ready. He had one more week left in his original plan, and he wanted to spend it simply being present with these three remarkable people. Not testing them, not observing them, just being their friend, because somewhere along the way, that's what they'd become. Not his projects or his experiments, his friends. And for the first time in decades, Robert Chen knew what true friendship felt like. It wasn't about business connections or mutual benefits. It was about showing up for each other day after day simply because you cared. These three people had shown him that, and he was about to change their lives forever. He just hoped they'd forgive him for the deception once they learned the truth. Robert's last day on the streets arrived with unusually warm sunshine. It was a Friday morning, exactly 4 weeks since he'd sat down on that cold sidewalk and watched the world walk past him. He felt different now. Not just physically, though. He'd lost weight and his body ached in places he didn't know could ache. He felt different inside, like something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. He was sitting in his usual spot when Lily came by with his breakfast. She looked more tired than usual, dark circles under her eyes that even her smile couldn't hide. "Rough night?" Robert asked as she handed him the coffee and sandwich. "3 people died on my shift," she said quietly, sitting down beside him on the pavement. She didn't usually sit for long, always rushing to get home to her daughter. But today she seemed to need a moment. A car accident victim, an elderly man with heart failure, and a teenager who overdosed. The teenager was the hardest. She was only 16. Her whole life ahead of her. "I'm sorry," Robert said, meaning it deeply. Lily wiped her eyes. "This job, sometimes it breaks your heart. But then I think about the people we do save. The lives we do help. It has to be enough, you know?" She looked at him. "How do you do it, Robert? How do you stay hopeful when life is so hard?" Robert thought about her question carefully. A month ago, sitting in his penthouse, he would have said something about perseverance or determination. But now, after living on these streets, after experiencing invisibility and kindness in equal measure, his answer was different. "People like you," he said simply. "People who stop and see me when everyone else looks away. People who share their breakfast when they're exhausted from saving lives all night. That's how you stay hopeful. You remember there's still good in the world. Lily smiled, a real smile this time, and squeezed his hand. You're a good person, Robert. I hope things get better for you soon. Around noon, Tony showed up with his lunchbox. But today was different. Tony seemed excited, almost bouncing on his feet. Robert, I got good news, man. Really good news. And what's that? My daughter, remember I told you about her? She got a scholarship, full ride. We found out yesterday. She's going to medical school for free. Can you believe it? My little girl is going to be a doctor and we don't have to pay for it. Tony's joy was so pure, so genuine that Robert felt his own eyes getting wet. Here was a man who'd shared his lunch with a homeless stranger every single day for weeks. And now his daughter's dreams were coming true. If anyone deserved good news, it was Tony. That's incredible, Robert said. You must be so proud. Proud doesn't even cover it. Me and my wife, we cried all night. Happy tears, you know. Tony opened his lunchbox, but today, instead of his usual sandwich, there was a whole feast. My wife packed extra today. She said to make sure you eat good because we're celebrating. She don't even know you, but she packed this food special for you. That's the kind of woman she is. They ate together and Tony talked about his daughter's future, about the kind of doctor she wanted to be, about how she'd always been so smart, even as a little girl. Robert listened and realized this was what wealth really looked like. Not the numbers in a bank account, but the richness of pride in your child, the joy of dreams coming true, the love of a family that celebrates together. Mrs. Patterson came by in the afternoon, which was unusual. She normally only stopped on Thursday mornings. She was carrying a small cake in a plastic container. I baked this last night, she announced. It's not fancy, but it's chocolate and everyone likes chocolate. What's the occasion? Robert asked. No occasion. I just thought we could all use something sweet in our lives. She started walking around to the other homeless people in the area, offering them each a slice of cake on a paper napkin. Some people looked at her like she was crazy. Others accepted it with grateful tears. Mrs. Patterson treated each person the same with dignity and kindness. When she came back to Robert, she sat down with a tired sigh. My feet aren't what they used to be, she said, laughing. But you know what? I figured out how to cover that rent increase. I'm going to start tutoring kids in the neighborhood, just reading and basic math, nothing fancy. But these young parents, they need help and they'll pay a little for it. So everything works out. Robert felt a lump in his throat. She'd found a solution that let her keep helping others while taking care of herself. Even facing her own struggles, her first thought was how to keep giving. As the afternoon turned to evening, Robert made a phone call on his hidden cell phone. Helen, it's time. Can you come tomorrow morning? Around 9? Finally, Helen said, relief clear in her voice. I'll be there. And Robert? I'm proud of you. This crazy plan of yours had actually worked. That night, Robert barely slept. He kept thinking about how the next day would unfold. Would they be angry? Would they feel betrayed? Would they understand why he'd done this? He'd spent a month lying to 3 people who'd shown him nothing but honesty and kindness. The guilt weighed on him heavy. Saturday morning arrived. Robert had asked Lily, Tony, and Mrs. Patterson to meet him at his usual corner at 9. He'd told them he had something important to share. They'd all agreed to come, probably worried about him, probably thinking he was in some kind of trouble. Lily arrived first, still in her scrubs from the night shift. Robert, are you okay? Your message sounded serious. I'm fine. Just wait, please. The others are coming too. Tony pulled up in his truck a few minutes later and Mrs. Patterson arrived shortly after, walking slowly but with determined steps. The 3 of them looked at each other, confused about why they were all there together. Do you all know each other? Lily asked. We've seen each other around, Tony said, but we've never really talked. Robert stood up from his spot on the pavement. His hands were shaking. Thank you all for coming. I need to tell you something and I need you to hear me out before you react. Just then, a black car pulled up to the curb. Helen stepped out looking professional in her business suit. She was carrying a briefcase and wore her lawyer face, serious and composed. The 3 friends looked at the car, then at Helen, then at Robert with growing confusion. Robert, what's going on? Mrs. Patterson asked, concern in her voice. Helen walked over and stood next to Robert. She looked at him with a slight nod as if to say, you can do this. Robert took a deep breath. My full name is Robert Chen. 4 weeks ago, I was living in a penthouse apartment overlooking this city. I own a tech company that's worth over $200 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. I came to these streets not because I had to, but because I wanted to find something. Or rather, someone. I was looking for people with real character, real kindness, real hearts. People who would help a stranger who had nothing to offer them in return. Robert's voice cracked with emotion. And I found you. All three of you. Lily's hand went to her mouth. Tony took a step back, shaking his head. Mrs. Patterson just stood very still, her eyes wide. For the past month, I've been testing you. Not all the time, but sometimes. The wallet Lily found and turned in, I planted it. When I collapsed and Tony took me to the hospital, I faked it. I've been watching all of you. Observing how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching. You lied to us, Lily said, her voice barely a whisper. This whole time you were lying? Yes, Robert said, and the shame in his voice was real. I lied about who I was, but everything else was real. My gratitude for your kindness was real. My respect for each of you is real. The way you made me feel human again when everyone else made me feel invisible, that was real. Tony's face had gone red. So this was all what? Some kind of game? Rich man plays pretend to see how the poor people act? No, Robert said firmly. It wasn't a game. It was a search. I'm 68 years old and I have no family. No children, no one to leave my fortune to. I could have left it all to charity and put my name on a building somewhere. But I wanted to find people who understood what wealth should really be used for. People who would use it to help others because that's who they are, not because it makes them look good. Helen opened her briefcase and pulled out some documents. I'm Helen Rodriguez, Mr. Chen's lawyer. Everything he's telling you is true.